Have you ever tried to convince a probable super spreader to get tested, only to have them respond by trying to stab you with a fork? Well, then you have something in common with the subject of this week's episode, a doctor whose apprehension of Typhoid Mary is only a footnote in a career that would see 90,000 babies saved before retiring with her vibrant writer companion. Welcome to the premiere of Sapphic History, where our series on high-achieving lesbians is kicking off with a turn-of-the-century public health pioneer, Dr. Sara Josephine Baker. Sara Josephine Baker, or Jo as everyone called her, was born in 1873 to a wealthy family in Poughkeepsie, just up the Hudson River from New York City. Her mother was one of the first graduates of Vassar, an elite women's college, while her father was self-educated, a prominent lawyer known for being hardworking and progressive. Young Jo was a self-described tomboy growing up, enjoying baseball and trout fishing with her father, and idolizing tomboy icon Jo March from Little Women, who she described as her favorite character in all of fiction. Life was Gilded Age good. Regattas in the summer and ice skating in the winter, staying at the luxurious Fifth Avenue Hotel for a weekend of shopping and theater in the city. And the future was settled. Jo would follow in her mother's footsteps and study at Vassar. But then tragedy struck. Jo's little brother Robert was only 13 when he passed away suddenly. The loss broke their father's heart, and he soon followed, succumbing to a typhoid epidemic that swept the town 3 months later. Settling the estate revealed that bad investments had left them with much less than expected. Vassar no longer seemed like a prudent use of the remaining money, at least not without a plan to get a return on that investment. A knee injury that had Jo seeing an orthopedist for 2 years got her casually thinking that perhaps medicine might be a good way to make money. But it was the ruthless discouragement when she mentioned the idea, or harebrained and unwomanly scheme as others thought it, that made her determined to actually do it. The year was 1893. Although it had been 45 years since Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell became the first woman to earn a U.S. medical degree, less than 5% of doctors were women. I had barely heard that there were such people, but was quite aware that the world did not wholly approve of them. Moreover, med school was even more expensive than Vassar, and both sides of the family were aghast at the idea of my spending so much money in such an unconventional way. But after recovering from the sticker shock, Jo's mom was supportive, trusting her daughter's judgment and realizing this wasn't so different from her own decision to attend Vassar when it was still new and unestablished. After taking a year to study and pass her entrance exams, Jo withdrew $5,000 of the remaining estate, around $175,000 in today's money, and set off for New York City. The Women's Medical College of the New York Infirmary was the only option for women wanting to study medicine in New York City. It was founded in 1868 by Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, along with her sister Dr. Emily Blackwell and their colleague Dr. Marie Zakshevska, though by the time of Jo's enrollment in 1894, only Dr. Emily remained, having settled down in the city with fellow gynecology professor Dr. Elizabeth Cushier. Over 28 years together, they bought summer homes in Maine and New Jersey, and raised an adopted Irish girl named Nanny. Emily's famous sister said of Cushier, "I do not know what Dr. Emily would do without her. She absolutely basks in her presence, and seems as if she had been waiting for her for a lifetime." But that's a biography for another day. Back to Jo, who needed a beat to adjust to her generally older and more serious classmates. She was lonely at first, watching the same comedy skits at Proctor's Vaudeville Theater multiple times a week while carrying human bones in her bag, which definitely sounds like some kind of cry for help. But that loneliness would quickly fade as she grew closer to one classmate in particular, Florence Marion Layton. Florence was 3 years older than Jo, and had also lost a sibling shortly before deciding to study medicine. Her younger sister Emily had died from tuberculosis at only 21. Their father was a popular merchant/fancy grocer in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and from photos they looked like a fun and active family. Camping and fishing trips, visiting historic sites in Washington, D.C. Florence's father and brother even traveled to California to try their hand at a little gold mining, stopping at the Hotel del Resort in San Diego along the way. And from these photos of Emily laughing as Florence shows off an unidentified gal pal in borrowed men's attire, as well as their financial support of Joe and Florence, I like to imagine they were an accepting family as well. Whatever Joe's family thought, Jo herself didn't seem to carry much particular moral angst about being a lesbian. Citing the influence of her great Aunt Abby, who would conclude Bible story time by saying they were very silly stories without a word of truth to them, and to not let anyone tell them otherwise. It would probably be hard to exaggerate the influence that sort of experience may have on a child, learning so early that it is possible to question the unquestionable. It was the beginning of my desire to question the right and wrong of all accepted doctrines. God bless you, Aunt Abby. Joe and Florence probably became a couple during med school, as upon graduation they'd move in together while doing their internships in Boston, closer to Florence's home and ailing father. Finally, putting theory into practice in some of Boston's worst slums, where alcoholism and all its ills were disturbingly widespread, quickly prepared them for dealing with anything. Joe recalls having to fight off a patient's angry, abusive husband while in the middle of delivering a baby, but luckily the man was so drunkenly unsteady that a push from a woman half his size was all it took to send him tumbling down the stairs, which he was in no state to reascend. After completing their internships, Dr. Baker and Dr. Layton were now official, and would return to New York City to open a practice together on West 91st Street near Central Park, with Dr. Layton's family giving them money to furnish and equip the office. It seems the amount was quite generous, as the pair bought a Prescott steamer, ostensibly for calling on patients, but really because at least one of them was super into this crazy new horseless carriage thing. This was the year 1900, so of course it was a death trap that shot flaming gasoline on startup, took 30 minutes to build up enough steam to move, and required carrying around a gallon bucket to fill the water tank every hour. It was unwieldy enough that small boys on the street would tease them to just get a horse. But the pair would go on to buy many more early cars together over the years, including an Oldsmobile that was steered using a lever instead of a wheel, a single-cylinder Cadillac, and 2 or 3 electrics. That's right, there were electric cars back then. In the year 1900, they comprised 1/3 of all vehicles on the road, compared to about 1% today, and New York City even had a fleet of electric taxis. However, the debut of Ford's Model T in 1908 at only 1/3 of the price of the average electric, coupled with the practical advantage of gas cars being untethered to charging stations, started a steady decline that would see the electrics basically gone by 1930. With hobbies like car collecting, it's pretty clear Dr. Baker was a woman with expensive taste, even if her pocketbook didn't always allow it. So, to supplement their income while getting their practice going, Dr. Baker decided to apply for a side job as a medical inspector for the Department of Health. As Tammany Hall corruption in New York politics was still in full swing, said application consisted of just knowing the right guy. A patient who was a judge vouched for her to what sounds like a cartoon of a man who smoked cigars with his feet up on the desk, and that was enough for him to bark at a clerk to, quote, give the lady her appointment, with no questions asked. As the hiring process probably should have indicated, the gig was basically a racket. Dr. Baker's first assignment was an hour a week inspecting school children and sending home any sick kids with a note recommending treatment. An ineffective way to communicate with parents that were largely illiterate or non-English speaking, and who couldn't afford treatment anyway. Most inspectors didn't even bother visiting the schools, simply calling to note how many kids were sick and collecting their paychecks. But an honest supervisor and the appointment of a new commissioner of health who promised to clean up the department convinced her to stay on for a second assignment, finding and reporting cases of sick babies in the tenement buildings of Hell's Kitchen. How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890 by photojournalist Jacob Riis, gives us some idea of the squalid conditions in tenements. Whole families crammed into one room, or single laborers renting not even a bed but a spot, with perhaps a water closet in the hallway for the whole floor to share, but more likely just an outhouse in the back. It was a grueling summer, seeing so many babies dying in unsanitary conditions, and hopeless mothers resigned to the inevitability of tragedy. Babies always died in the summer. Everyone knew that. The problem seemed insurmountable, and Dr. Baker's medical advice useless. What good is it to recommend pasteurized milk when the milk available to these people arrived in rusty containers dotted with flies and swimming with bacteria. What's more, other inspectors pulled her aside to explain that she must not understand how things worked around here. You weren't actually supposed to visit all the mothers and babies and report loads of cases. It makes the rest of them look bad when they don't report any. And they were right. It did make them look bad. At the end of the summer, dozens of inspectors were fired for failing to do their inspections, and Dr. Baker was promoted for her tenacity. The commissioner had followed through with his promise. From then on, assignments were much more substantive, administering smallpox vaccines to the hard-to-track homeless population, writing pamphlets on prevention of rabies or sunstroke, even tracking a meningitis outbreak. But the most famous event from this period was halting an outbreak of the same disease that took her father, by apprehending Mary Mallon, who you might know better as Typhoid Mary. It's one of the most famous stories in epidemiology, the classic example of asymptomatic spread. An unusual outbreak of typhoid was striking wealthy, seemingly unconnected New York families. Unusual because typhoid typically struck in unsanitary conditions or from contaminated water, and neither was present here. With all the pipes, toilets, and even the cesspool at an outbreak site testing negative for typhoid, sanitation engineer George Soper was hired to determine the source. He eventually put together that there was a connection, a cook named Mary Mallon who left suddenly and without a forwarding address shortly after each outbreak began. 7 of the last 8 families she had cooked for had experienced typhoid outbreaks, with at least one death. I'm not sure a better bedside manner would have secured Mary's cooperation, since she was defensive from the start, but it probably didn't help when the guy that had been basically stalking her showed up at her boyfriend's apartment asking for some of her stool, with, I'm sure, all the social grace that engineers are known for. So George notified the New York City Health Department of his findings, which in turn tasked Dr. Baker with collecting the samples. After having the door angrily slammed in her face, Dr. Baker returned the next day with 5 policemen. But Mary was waiting. Wielding a large kitchen fork like a sword, she lunged through the door at Dr. Baker, who fell backwards onto the policeman, causing enough of a distraction for Mary to escape. They would spend the next 5 hours searching for her. Footprints leading to a chair by the fence had them searching the neighbor's property as well. Finally, they found her in a closet whose door had been hidden behind a pile of ash cans by sympathetic co-workers. Dr. Baker recounts, Mary came out fighting and swearing, both of which she could do with appalling efficacy and vigor. I made another effort to talk to her sensibly and asked her again to let me have the specimens, but it was of no use. By that time, she was convinced that the law was wantonly persecuting her when she had done nothing wrong. She knew she had never had typhoid fever. She was maniacal in her integrity. There was nothing I could do but take her with us. The policeman lifted her into the ambulance, and I literally sat on her all the way to the hospital. It was like being in a cage with an angry lion. Mary's blood, saliva, and urine came back clean, but her stool tested positive for massive amounts of typhoid bacteria. And as Mary admitted to never washing her hands, this confirmed the route of transmission. She was quarantined on North Brother Island, where she threatened to kill Dr. Baker if she ever got out. Mary unfortunately would kill when she got out, just not Dr. Baker. After 3 years testing positive and refusing a gallbladder removal to try and clear the infection, understandable given the state of surgery in 1910, Mary was released on the condition that she promise not to cook for other people. But Mary wasn't going to let the government or doctors tell her what to do, and quickly vanished. Taking on a fake name and apparently still not washing her hands after pooping, she went back to working as a cook in a maternity hospital, resulting in 25 cases and 2 more deaths. When Dr. Baker went to investigate the outbreak, sure enough, there was Mary, earning her living in the hospital kitchen and spreading typhoid germs among mothers and babies and doctors and nurses like a destroying angel. Mary was arrested and would spend the rest of her life in quarantine, having caused at least 3 deaths and 47 directed infections, but almost certainly more since there are chunks of time when her whereabouts while infectious were unknown. Dr. Baker, being far more forgiving than I am, says that she learned to like Mary and respect her point of view, seeing it as simply a tragedy that Mary had, quote, that blind, panicky distrust of doctors and all their works, which crops up so often among the uneducated, and among the educated too, for that matter. While some problems of the past are unfortunately still with us, it is important to remember that problems can be solved, even those that seem insurmountable. For example, Dr. Baker's first disappointingly ineffective experience with school health inspections. Conditions had only gotten worse. One inspection found 80% of the students had lice. Scabies and ringworm were rampant, and sending kids home just resulted in empty classrooms and confused parents, especially when the truant officers showed up and just ordered the kid back to school. In Dr. Baker's words, it was a thoroughly insane situation. A bit out of their depth, the health department brought in Miss Lena Rogers, a nurse experienced in administering social services, to help them develop a plan of action, an experiment that would establish the position of the school nurse. The first step was home education. Many tenement families didn't know how to effectively treat these ailments, or even that something could be done. It just seemed like it came with living in the poor part of New York. So a door-to-door information campaign was launched for lice, which is easily treatable, but only if you do it correctly, using a cheap chemical wash to kill the eggs so they don't hatch and start the infection all over again. The second was tailoring the response to the risk. For skin diseases, which were generally more irritating than dangerous, it was decided that reporting to a school nurse every day to have a protective treatment applied would be sufficient for reducing the risk of infecting other children. But for trachoma, a highly contagious eye disease that is still the leading cause of preventable blindness in the developing world today, much more stringent precautions were necessary. Affected children were isolated into special classes to prevent contact with others, and clinics were set up to provide treatment to those with advanced cases, which often required surgery. The program was a great success, nearly eliminating all the mentioned afflictions in New York within 15 years, and there was soon a nurse in every school in America. Ms. Rogers' guidance in breaking down a complex, community-level problem with multiple causes into doable tasks was inspirational for Dr. Baker, setting up a template for her work preventing infant deaths. Babies died in the summer. Everyone knew that. But they died more often in New York. A recent mortality statistics report revealed that not only did the city have a high overall mortality compared to similar metros like London, but that a shocking number of those deaths were children. A full 1/3 of all deaths were children under 5 years old, and 1/5 of all deaths were babies under 1 year old. Tasked with responding to this embarrassing finding, Dr. Baker proposed the novel idea of reducing the mortality rate by focusing on preventing babies from getting sick in the first place. Which might seem stupidly obvious, but preventative medicine wasn't really a thing yet in 1908 New York. There was no shortage of outbreaks to respond to, so why would you waste staff and money on people who aren't even sick? Still, Dr. Baker got the green light to run a trial over the summer, utilizing as staff the newly hired school nurses who would be available during the summer holidays. They would target a district with a very high baby death rate, a particularly stifling nest of tenement houses populated mostly with recent Italian immigrants. The program was quite simple. The registrar of records would send them a list of the previous day's births, and a thoroughly trained nurse would be sent to each address to discuss appropriate care in fine detail. Just simple tips, but ones that could easily be overlooked in a new, unfamiliar environment. Insistence on breastfeeding, since the milk and formulas sold cheaply to tenement women were often unsafe. And explaining that old country common sense about the dangers of drafts or what to swaddle a baby with wouldn't be applicable to poorly ventilated tenements during the hot summer months. Open windows, thin summer clothes, and frequent bathing were encouraged. By the end of the pilot program, the results were more dramatic than anyone expected. While other areas maintained a high level of infant mortality, the district with the program had 1,200 fewer deaths compared to the previous summer. Sure, everyone knew babies died during the summer, but they didn't have to. That August, the health department officially created the Bureau of Child Hygiene and appointed Dr. Baker as chief. Being a woman in a position of power can be complicated, and Dr. Baker could never quite decide if her sex hurt or helped her cause. The cons were obvious: sexism in all its many forms, most notably when she was first assigned as staff for the new bureau. The 6 doctors assigned to her, all males with expertise necessary for the bureau to succeed, tendered their resignation on the grounds that they couldn't take orders from a woman. Having worked with all of them previously, Dr. Baker managed to talk them into holding off on their resignations for a month, during which she gave them all interesting assignments and important-sounding titles. By the end of the month, as planned, they had changed their minds and would all stay with the bureau for many more years. Blending in was one way to deflect attention away from the novelty of her womanhood. It was the health department's idea to list her as Dr. S.J. Baker to disguise the presence of a woman in the executive suites, and Dr. Baker took a similar approach to her clothing. I wore a standard costume, almost a uniform, because the last thing I wanted to be was conspicuously feminine when working with men. I am sure that there are today a great number of my old-time friends who never saw me dressed in any other way, for I wore that costume in my daily work for over 25 years. The popularity of the Gibson girl aesthetic had brought masculine-style shirtwaists into fashion for women, something that Dr. Baker was thankful for, as it made people more comfortable with her look of shirtwaists and man-tailored suit jackets, allowing her to visually blend in with her peers instead of standing out in a dress. In fact, it worked so well that a colleague with the apparent observational powers of Mr. Magoo would later rant to her about female doctors being appointed as medical inspectors, until Dr. Baker finally interrupted, incredibly amused. "What kind of creature do you think you are talking to now?" His jaw dropped and he blushed purple. "Good Lord," he said, "I'd entirely forgotten you were a woman." Classic. As for the upsides to being the only female bureau chief, the novelty of the situation meant the press was far more likely to report on their efforts, essential for a fledgling bureau trying to attract funding and raise awareness for their campaigns. The first order of business for the new Bureau of Child Hygiene would be the change I suspect was most responsible for the sharp drop in infant mortality during the pilot program: getting people to stop feeding babies milk that was basically a cesspool of bacteria. Pasteurization, the process of heating liquids to kill off bacteria, was around at the time of the century, but hardly universal, especially since techniques of the time gave milk a cooked taste. What's more, many poorer people purchased milk that was not only unpasteurized, but loose. That is, sold in a nightmare version of the bulk food section, where anyone could dip their unwashed cup directly into a shared container. Adding an additional layer of madness, the milk being carted into New York City came from 6 different states, all with their own regulations or complete lack thereof. And to top it all off, refrigeration wouldn't be invented for another 20 years. So if your local discount milk peddler was skimping on the ice at any point in the storage or delivery process during a hot summer day, there was probably some spoilage going on. Reforms like making pasteurization standard and properly regulating and labeling milk would be important long-term solutions championed by activists like Nathan Strauss and the newly established precursor to the FDA. But the immediate response, providing safe milk to babies needing to be fed now, would be the Bureau's job. Promoting breastfeeding may have been sufficient for a 2-month pilot program with newborns, but it wasn't a sustainable solution. Most tenement mothers worked and couldn't afford to stay home for 6 months until the baby was weaned, or bring the baby to a place like a garment factory to nurse. So, to prevent infant deaths rather than just delay them for a month or two, access to safe formula milk would be crucial. Using data on infant deaths due to diarrheal causes, and coordinating with existing private milk charities to avoid duplicate work, clean milk stations were set up where they were needed most, with prices subsidized to be a few cents cheaper than other available milk in order to get people into the door. Once there, staff could explain the importance of clean milk, and that quality milk still needed to be kept properly chilled, dispensed using sterilized bottles, and modified for an infant's needs. I should note here that our understanding of milk and baby formula has advanced dramatically since 1910. Back then, milk would be altered to match the fat and protein ratios of breast milk more closely, but these formulas often lacked essential nutrients, as this was before we had even invented the word vitamin, let alone understood why we needed them. So while modified milk distributed at the milk depots was a huge step up from rusty vats of raw milk sitting at room temperature for a day, you should never use old recipes for baby formula, no matter how viral they go on Facebook. In 1910, however, milk depots were a huge hit. Soon, not even just among the lower classes, but to anyone impressed with the stringent safety standards. Doctors would direct sickly babies towards the milk stations by writing prescriptions for clean milk, and milk depots served as the community point of contact for the Bureau's initiatives. Nurses conducting weigh-ins and wellness checks every few milk pickups to ensure the baby was thriving, free classes on infant care for new mothers, and the start of the Little Mothers League. It was an unfortunate reality of the times that while tenement parents worked long hours, infants would often be looked after by sisters who were themselves still children, sometimes all of 8 years old. Unsurprisingly, this was a contributor to infant mortality, so the logic was that training these older sisters, or little mothers, to be responsible babysitters would make the situation less dangerous. Eliminating the need for poor children to take on the responsibility of mothers at all would have, of course, been ideal, but the Bureau's job was to mitigate immediate dangers to babies until social reforms could catch up. We could not afford the luxury of saying things should or should not be. We had to work realistically with the raw materials and situations at hand. Little Mothers Leagues were set up as school clubs, where children would make a game of learning how to not recklessly endanger their infant siblings, putting on skits about how to handle things like monitoring a sick baby, and earning badges for lessons passed. A list of do's and don'ts the children put together ranges from the amusing, "don't give the baby beer to drink," to the horrifyingly indicative of such a training program's necessity in decreasing mortality. Don't leave the baby in the carriage and play with your friends, and don't leave the baby on the stove. All in all, the efforts of the Bureau of Child Hygiene in reducing infant mortality in New York City were wildly successful. In 1911, just 3 years on from that first pilot program, infant mortality would fall by an astounding 40%. The Federal Children's Bureau was established in 1912 to take the mission national, and other states soon started their own bureaus of child hygiene. By Dr. Baker's retirement in 1923, New York City, once the embarrassment of the developed world when it came to infant mortality, would have the lowest infant mortality rate of any major city in the U.S. Health departments across the world would model aspects of their own children's health initiatives after Dr. Baker's ideas, with inquiries coming from as far away as India, Japan, and South America. While all this was going on in Dr. Baker's government career, it seems like Joe and Florence had carved out a nice little life for themselves. The private practice the two had started together was thriving, bringing in far more money now than Joe's government salary, though her position likely contributed to their roster of mostly child patients. The pair bought a house together, a 4-story affair on a side street off Central Park that had once belonged to famous stage actress Rose Coughlin. Finding time for date night can be challenging for two busy doctors, but Joe mentions a few nearby activities. Central Park for a few spare moments, boarding an open-air tour bus and listening to cheery visitors marveling at the city with fresh eyes, or a night out at one of the breezy rooftop gardens that were all the rage, with anyone who couldn't flee to a country home all summer, working professionals, as well as the more bohemian artsy crowd. If when I say rooftop garden, you're picturing a tranquil rooftop with some plants and patio furniture, maybe a little cafe, I urge you to think bigger. Roof garden decor went hard. Olympia Theater's Cherry Blossom Grove was like a magical fairy world with its 3,000 electric lights, soaring glass dome, and artificial alpine stream complete with craggy rocks, wooden bridges, and a duck pond. The gigantic Paradise Roof Garden had a section themed like a Dutch farm, including 2 real cows and a windmill that spun colored lights. As you might have gleaned from all the stages, live entertainment was a mainstay of the gardens. There were acrobats, bare-legged dancers, jugglers, contortionists, vaudeville theater, pantomimes, and a German dude that managed to train not 1, but 18 cats, who performed their tasks with, as the New York Times described it, moderately well-concealed reluctance. However, the outbreak of World War I would put a damper on variety acts, and the advent of cinemas and advances in air conditioning technology gave people other options for entertainment and staying cool. Roof gardens would fade away, with one notable exception that managed to pivot their business model. Also coming to an end was Jo and Florence's relationship. We don't know when exactly Jo and Florence broke up or why, but it was likely sometime between 1914 and the mid-1920s. What we do know is that 1914 was a year of massive change for Jo. A new health commissioner cracking down on moonlighting in the department forced Jo to quit her shared practice with Florence, and the emphatic way Jo writes that she didn't want to quit kind of feels like someone rehashing an argument they've had countless times. It seems like Jo felt her hands were tied, but I could understand if Florence felt differently about Jo choosing the bureau over what they had spent 15 years building together, and if that set off or contributed to the break. Census records can't tell us if Florence ever found love again, only that she would never marry a man and live out the rest of her days in a modern Upper West Side luxury apartment home. 1914 was also when Jo started to get more into feminism and the suffrage movement. Perhaps she just suddenly had a lot more time on her hands without her second job, or maybe with her career as a bureau chief firmly established, she felt secure getting more political. Perhaps it was a post-breakup new hobby, or the influence of a women's group she had recently joined. More on that in a minute. Regardless of the reason, Dr. Baker had a new cause to fight for. I did not start out as a feminist at all, but it was impossible to resist the psychological suction which gradually drew you into active participation in the great struggle to get political recognition of the fact that women are as much human beings as men are. A struggle that's still ongoing, apparently. But focusing specifically on the right to vote, Dr. Baker was one of the early participants in the annual suffrage parade up Fifth Avenue, which grew larger and more spectacular every year, with women on horseback like cavalry colonels to marshal the parade. Soon costumes were introduced, most famously Vassar alum Inez Mulholland, astride a white horse with her white cape flowing dramatically behind her, like the beautiful Joan of Arc of the suffragette movement. Her tragic death from pernicious anemia at only 30 would cement her image as an icon of the cause. Dr. Baker was part of the contingent of college women dressed in academic caps and gowns, an issue of current relevance to her as NYU Bellevue Hospital Medical School had asked her to lecture on child hygiene for the new Doctor of Public Health program. She agreed, as long as she'd be allowed to take classes and get the degree as well, since it'd hardly do to have her own students outrank her. But she was refused, as the college didn't accept female students. It was only after failing to find anyone else that could teach the new subject that NYU Bellevue finally caved. Naturally, they could not admit me and deny entrance to other women, so another set of long-barred doors opened to the female of the species. The classroom wasn't the only place Dr. Baker would lecture. Street corner soapbox speeches where suffragettes made their case to anyone who would listen was a common form of activism. Dr. Baker did her orating in a vacant store near the New York Stock Exchange to an audience of almost exclusively young male Wall Street clerks and office boys, killing time between their lunch hour. Witty comebacks and good humor were the key to winning this particular crowd over to Jo's side, showing them that suffragettes were not window-smashing, bloomers-wearing freaks, but normal, give-and-take people able to take care of themselves and look the world squarely in the eye. We had to have that sort of recognition in order to make any headway against the masculine conviction that suffragism was just crank stuff. Not that Jo looked down on those more militant suffragettes who did things like storm the House of Commons in England, chain themselves to railings, and generally have a, quote, violent good time in a good cause. Although Jo favored the methodical, strategic approach of suffragette leader Carrie Chapman Catt, her reaction to a speech from the more militant suffragette leader Emmeline Pankhurst was that we did not agree with her methods, but we went away feeling we had been in touch with an inspired and courageous leader. Reasonable minds can disagree on which approach was ultimately more effective. Dr. Baker believes the measured approach won out, as it was Mrs. Catt that had gotten President Woodrow Wilson to meet with a group of suffragettes, including Dr. Baker, to make a statement in support of women's suffrage. But one could also argue that President Wilson's support only came once public opinion on the issue had shifted, possibly as a result of the more attention-grabbing tactics. The arrest of suffragettes that picketed outside the White House for months, and their subsequent mistreatment and hunger strike while in prison, had garnered public sympathy, so continued silence on the matter would have been a bad look. Circling back to the women's group I mentioned earlier, Dr. Baker's active involvement in feminism coincided with her being an early member of Heterodoxy, which she describes in her autobiography as a luncheon club for women involved in various social and economic movements. An accurate, if incredibly understated, summation. A New York Tribune expose called it the de facto Star Chamber Council of the prominent women of New York. And not prominent as in heiresses and socialites, but as in women who did things, and did them openly. Whether it was organizing labor strikes or managing a brokerage firm on Wall Street. As those disparate examples might suggest, it was purposefully a group with varied viewpoints. Democrats, Republicans, prohibitionists, socialists, anarchists, liberals, and radicals of all opinions. The bi-weekly meetings would be organized around a particular topic, sometimes with a relevant guest speaker, and nothing was off limits. Here, in this secret gathering away from the ears of men, they could speak freely on topics like birth control with the woman who coined the term, guest speaker Margaret Sanger. Such conversations couldn't happen in public. Margaret Sanger would flee to England later that year after her writings on birth control led to an indictment for 9 violations of the Comstock laws against obscenity. Other controversial topics included pacifism, considered unpatriotic in the face of World War I, and love, given that the guest speaker was Edith Ellis, a probable lesbian in an open marriage with sexologist Havelock Ellis, who wrote the first English-language textbook on homosexuality. Of course, it wasn't just edgy topics. They talked about education reform and women in theater, and invited guest speakers like Helen Keller as well. But regardless, the first Red Scare during World War I led to the group falling under suspicion because of the number of socialists and radicals on the rolls, forcing them to change meeting locations every week just to avoid being watched. It was all very cloak and dagger, a situation which Dr. Baker lambasts as thoroughly ridiculous, with a story portraying her supposed sisters in treason as comically harmless. Following a discussion on poetry, guest speaker and poet Amy Lowell was inundated with requests to read aloud their favorite of her works, with one woman weeping into her neighbor's neck at the beautiful sadness of it all, until Amy had had enough. They told me I was to be speaking to a group of intellectual, realistic, tough-minded leaders in the woman's world. Instead, I find a group that wants nothing but my most sentimental things. Good afternoon. And she poked her cigar in her mouth and walked out glowering. I love how this story hits different, depending on whether or not you're in the know. To someone suspicious of what women could be up to, gathering without men around, it soothes their fears and their ego with assurances that it's just silly woman nonsense like weeping over poetry. But to a particular subcategory of Amy Lowell poetry fans who recognize the lesbian subtext in an ode to hands, or that those poems about flowers were not literally about flowers, this seemingly dismissive story is actually delightfully subversive. Only at a heterodoxy meeting could you have a bunch of lesbians derail a literary discussion into a live reading of lesbian poetry by the author herself. Taking a brief detour back to Dr. Baker's professional life, I have to address the 1918 flu pandemic and add some crucial context to assertions you may have seen on your right-wing aunt's Facebook page about how New York City didn't close the schools and ended up with a lower death rate than cities that had. First is what staying at home would have meant. In 1918, a full 75% of New York's 1 million schoolchildren lived in tenements, which, as we've seen in this video, were often severely overcrowded, with poor ventilation and sanitation facilities, and little adult supervision. Such an environment was far more likely to spread disease than well-ventilated schools, staffed with nurses who could be coordinated to organize intense disease prevention measures. It was Dr. Baker, with her intimate knowledge of both tenement and school environments, who convinced the health commissioner to not simply keep the schools open, but to use them as a system where you could examine 1/5 of the population of this city every morning and control every person who showed any symptom of influenza. The Bureau deployed literally all their staff to frantically check every child for signs of the flu at the start of every school day. This brings us to the second point, how particular diseases spread. Scanning for symptoms made sense because, unlike COVID-19, the 1918 flu wasn't known to spread via asymptomatic carriers, and the incubation period was very short. you'd start feeling really sick within 24 hours of exposure. Finally, the New York City Health Department implemented all kinds of disease control measures, keeping each class in a school isolated from the others, staggering work hours for different industries to prevent crowding during commutes, masking in public, and reminding people that drinking from a communal cup is, in fact, a health hazard. Yeah, early drinking fountain designs were pretty gross. The flu still killed a lot of people, but the efforts of the New York City Health Department kept the pandemic death rate lower than cities not nearly as large or crowded. Only 4.7 of every 1,000 New Yorkers died of the flu, compared to 6.5 in Boston and 7.4 in Philadelphia, the city that famously decided to throw a parade with no control measures whatsoever, and within 72 hours had filled every hospital bed in the city. After the pandemic, the mission of the New York City Bureau of Child Hygiene continued to expand, with vital funding provided by the 1921 Shepard-Towner Act, which was vehemently opposed by what Dr. Baker calls the stupider kind of conservatives, who considered it socialism. A physician representative from the American Medical Association was shockingly blunt. "We oppose this bill because if you are going to save the lives of all these women and children at the public expense, what inducement will there be for young men to study medicine?" It's an impressive amount of offense to cram into a single sentence. Callousness about the lives of women and children, casual erasure of the young women who want to study medicine, and assuming the young men who want to study are as cold-hearted as the speaker. As for homophobia, Missouri Senator James Reed had that covered, taking a shot at the unmarried women like Dr. Baker who staffed the bureaus, saying the bill was sponsored by endocrine perverts and derailed menopausics, and sarcastically proposing that these female celibates, too refined to have a husband, be assigned a committee of mothers to take charge of the old maids and teach them how to acquire husbands and have babies of their own. Gross. The act would pass in 1921, and by 1923, all 48 states had a Bureau of Child Hygiene, Dr. Baker's benchmark for when she would allow herself to retire. From government work, at least, she'd continue to lecture and write papers and serve on so many boards and committees that retirement might not be the best descriptor. A newspaper article on her departure from the Bureau ran the numbers and printed that over the course of her career, Dr. Baker was responsible for saving the lives of 90,000 babies. That's a Taylor Swift Eras Tour audience, plus 15,000 more people. It's a fantastic note to end a career on, but it's not the end of our story. Writer Ida Alexa Ross Wylie, known by her pen name I.A.R. Wylie, lived quite the life and probably needs her own episode to have it told fully. Born in Australia, raised in England, schooled in Belgium and Germany, she had been one of those more militant English suffragettes running a safe house for fugitive women, which is how she met her long-term girlfriend Rachel Barrett. During World War I, she channeled her experiences in Germany into the novel Towards Morning to examine how average Germans could end up supporting fascism and atrocities. It's a theme she would revisit in later writing, as she grew more alarmed over the rise of the Nazis in Germany and Nazi sympathizers in the US, most famously in her murder mystery story, Keeper of the Flame, which was adapted into a 1942 film starring Katharine Hepburn. In 1920, Ida and Rachel spent a year traveling across America, attending a Heterodoxy meeting in New York, riding mules into the Grand Canyon, escaping a political revolt in Guatemala, road tripping up California, and visiting the Hollywood lot where one of Ida's stories was being adapted into a movie. It starred Alla Nazimova, who is rumored to have coined the phrase sewing circle as a discreet way to reference the community of lesbian and bisexual women in Hollywood. When the couple returned to England, settling into a little cottage with their 2 dogs, Ida soon found herself restless with the new, slower pace of life, and Rachel's objections to late nights and missing her afternoon nap, or opinion that it was foolish and extravagant to break windows just for the sheer fun of it now that the suffrage days were over. It was an amicable separation when Ida decided to go back to the US alone. She and Rachel would remain close, with Ida staying over during yearly trips back to England, and Rachel bringing her bull terrier Susan to New York once it became clear that Ida intended to stay there, having met the next great love of her life. Somewhere in those first years, I met Dr. S. Josephine Baker, who it seemed had read Towards Morning and yearned to meet the author. Unfortunately, I had no idea who she was, or that she had occupied a unique position in the medical world and New York civic life. I had never heard of the baby death rate, and certainly did not know what she had done to it, so that my opening gambit, "Are you still practicing, Dr. Baker?" produced a noticeable chill. I'm gonna guess that reaction was less about not being recognized, and more about it seeming like Ida was bringing up Joe's falling out with Florence, given that Ida was known to be in the loop about lesbian gossip from London to Los Angeles. However, we met again and she forgave my insular ignorance. We drifted into sharing a New York apartment together. Joe and Ida were alike in some ways. Both had a trailblazing fearlessness to them, had been huge theater nerds in the 1890s despite the 12-year age difference making Ida just a child at the time, and they shared values like respect for racial minorities and the working class. In other ways, they were very different. Joe was practical and objective, while Ida was driven by her emotions. She had a spark of the chaotic in her, and if there was anything Dr. Baker excelled at, it was jumping into and managing chaos. In my everyday life and in their different ways, they look after me and see that I don't go out with my hat back to front. And when I fall over my own feet, they pick me up and dust me off. On my side, I am secretly convinced that I manage both of them. The other person Ida is referring to is Dr. Louise Pierce, a Heterodoxy member famous for her work developing a treatment for African sleeping sickness and her travels to the Congo to deploy it. By the 1930s, Ida had grown sick of apartment living and wanted a yard for her dog, so when Dr. Pierce's work took her to Princeton, Ida and Joe decided to go along too and share a real house with her. Joe Baker, except for a dozen or so committees, had retired from public life and was not unwilling to prove that she could manage a house just as efficiently as she ran the Bureau of Child Hygiene. She proved it. They leased a charming 15-room house built in the 1700s, which Ida would christen Trevana Farm after her birthplace in Australia, and the name has stuck until now. Some of the house's interesting features include a high-ceilinged parlor with twin fireplaces for entertaining, a miniature working fireplace less than 2 feet square, meant for children but that was likely enjoyed by Ida's dogs, and one of those house-in-a-box kits Ida had purchased at the 1939 New York World's Fair and set up as a guest cottage. According to visitors, the house was a most delightful and interesting place to live and study. Louise's shelves were crowded with many old editions of medical treasures, the latest scientific literature, and the latest works on international questions. She had a wonderful collection of Chinese carvings and porcelains. Princeton locals referred to them as the girls, the odd sorority of accomplished women outside a university that wouldn't start accepting female students until 1969. There may be other designations mercifully concealed from us, but whatever people thought, they have been very kind to us. They even became friends with their landlords, a writer and his wife that would join them by the fireplaces when they were in town. Then Hugh and I can talk somberly of writers and how hard it is that nobody really understands us, and tell each other that we are never going to write again. Our respective families sit on the sidelines and sigh faintly, and talk somberly of writers too, and what it takes to live with them. Ida was amusingly self-deprecating about herself, describing her attitude towards my intimates, to whom I am sometimes playfully known as uncle, as faintly masculine and even patriarchal. I like to be taken care of, to have my clothes mended, my scattered possessions picked up and reassembled for me, and my hand held when my head aches and I know I am never going to write again. So naturally she was exclusively drawn to the sort of woman who would never tolerate such nonsense. When I am ill, after first washing their hands of me, they lead me to understand that either I am imagining a lot of unimportant symptoms, or that if I've got what I think I've got, I'll get well anyway, or die anyway. It's not encouraging, but it has saved me a lot of doctor's bills. Though, when it really mattered, Joe would pull out all the stops, tracking down an expat doctor who operated out of embassies when Ida had a serious case of dysentery during a trip to the Soviet Union, as I doubted if the patient's effete bourgeois constitution could have survived the methods of the local talent. 1930s Stalinist Russia wasn't the most conventional holiday destination, especially for Jo, who didn't even have a passport until retirement, when she spent a summer in Europe disappointing hotel managers and adoring fans who were expecting the famous entertainer of the same name. Apologies to anyone who clicked on this video and was similarly misled, as she's also the more famous Sapphic. But back to the USSR. The Saturday Evening Post wanted Ida to explore the Soviet Union and write about it, so Jo went along, both to make sure she survived, and also out of professional curiosity about Russia's state healthcare system, given that public healthcare had kind of been her whole deal. It was somehow both impressive and deeply disappointing at the same time. On the one hand, the Soviet Union presents the modern world's most outstanding example of a widespread, comprehensive, centralized system of child welfare. The Prophylactarium in Leningrad, with its large-scale baby clinic, had the best exhibit on infant hygiene Dr. Baker had ever seen. And even the most rural areas of the massive country had a dedicated children's clinic and doctor. But everything fell apart in the execution. The revolution had lost a lot of middle-class Russian medical faculty, so those plentiful doctors were not always well trained. The masses often had no means to implement the advice on infant hygiene or from child clinics. The best hospital facilities were third-rate by American standards and lacking basic medical supplies, with Dr. Baker witnessing a surgery performed without anesthesia waved away as normal. And fixing any of these problems was impossible when it seemed forbidden to admit that there were any problems at all. The doctors that didn't mysteriously disappear before Dr. Baker could meet them provided her with impossible statistics for things like the rate of complications after surgery. The only way I could account for it was that the Communist Party had outlawed sepsis, along with the private ownership of the means of production. Ida had accepted the assignment on the condition that she be able to write whatever she wanted, and warned her editor that she was liable to come back a raging communist. But the Soviet Union failed to impress. They reserved a Lincoln car, but got a nameless death trap whose wheel came loose on the hairpin turns of the Caucasus Mountains, and spent a night stranded in a train station after being bumped for a party of high officials. The final disillusionment came when they met up with Ida's ex and her companion in Leningrad, and were assigned particularly dark and smelly hotel rooms. The hotel manager insisted they were the best available, until Jo mentioned being first class, and he suddenly found the group an elegantly furnished, massive 7-room suite that must have been reserved for the elite. I went expecting to see equal pay and equal methods of life and living. Instead, I found as great a hiatus between the rich and the poor as may be found in any capitalistic state. While neither really enjoyed the trip, there was one sublime moment of spiritual triumph over the USSR when they stopped in the seaside resort town of Yalta. Their tour guide Ernest, who was conveniently also a Soviet intelligence agent, was just as surprised as they were to discover that the local beach attire was not swimsuits, but birthday suits. Without batting an eye, 50-year-old Ida sensed an opportunity to mess with a young man, keeping tabs on them on behalf of the communist regime. "How free, how wise, how beautiful," I said as I sat down to take off my stockings. When I looked up, communism had fled. Presumably, Jo and Ida enjoyed their laissez-faire swim in peace. Jo would pass away from cancer in 1945, at 72 years old, and be buried in the Baker family plot in Poughkeepsie. Ida and Louise would continue to live together at Trevana Farm until both passed within 2 months of each other in 1959, both at age 74. Due to their close relationship with the landlords, they were both buried in the house's family cemetery plot. Ida's dogs Susan, Nick, and Sarah were also granted admission, and headstones of their own. Today, Dr. Baker's legacy lives on mostly among public health history enthusiasts and those promoting women in medicine, which I'm sure she'd be very pleased about. But I rarely see her on lists of historical lesbians. As far as I know, I'm the first person to put together an in-depth look into her personal life. Apparently there's not a lot of crossover between public health policy history nerds and gay history nerds. So if other fields are more your speed, you're in luck, because we've planned a whole season of meticulously researched deep dives into lesbians who made massive impacts in their respective fields, from art to astrophysics. Please consider subscribing so you can be alerted when the next episode comes out, and also because it'll really help this channel get off the ground so we can continue making and improving our content. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll join us next time for another episode of Sapphic History.